Good afternoon to you all. Daniel Miller here. How is everybody doing today? Yet again, a cloudy and drizzly and somewhat miserable type of day here in London suburbs. But nevertheless, we are grinning and bearing, and we are enjoying our favorite games here on consoles and also on various platforms as well as Twitch. And today we are coming back to Red Dead Redemption 2. And as you know, we've been streaming the game in view of its disappearance from Xbox Game Pass. And today we'll start with a podcast that is dedicated to, well, two different entities. One is the game itself, the Red Dead Redemption 2 and Rockstar Studios. We'll hear a bit about how the game was conceived, created, what the ideas behind its initiation really were, and also we'll be looking at the way this game is representing American history, and that's very interesting as I painstakingly researched some of the attributes that were given to the game initially and discovered some interesting bits of trivia. So I'm sure that everyone who is a great Red Dead Redemption fan will enjoy listening about some of these and finding out more bits and pieces about the game overall and some of the historic figures which are represented here. It's very important to remember that this is a fictitious game, although through the actual gameplay we are going to be collecting lots of items for inventory, and then therefore through the exploration of particular items we are going to be becoming more knowledgeable on the history of America overall. Don't forget the game is taking place in the latter part of the 19th century. The second installment is a prequel to the first one, which is also an interesting concept, and we kind of get to know various characters, and through them we enter different situations, and in those situations we learn all about the way people lived at that time. They try to make it as close as possible to the real life, and you will find the settlements and the towns and villages in there to be very, very much aligned and in tune with all of those kind of historic facts and figures, the way people actually were. And it's a true joy to be able to walk through that world and become fully immersed and acquainted with their way of life. I have to say it's not particularly novel, as we've seen that in the games like Assassin's Creed Odyssey, for instance, and we'll see that again in Valhalla. That will be coming our way later in the year, where we visit one particular era of history that is beautifully researched and we kind of relive it. I think that's the greatest strength of those games. You really are becoming, or you do become, an active participant in the world that's long gone, and first of all you soak up all the niceties, the environment, the elements that are present on the screen. You go through different houses, different buildings, different locations. Eventually you get to know more about the characters, the way they lived. You are becoming then very acquainted with that kind of period of history, and you really want to do a bit more research. I think in Assassin's Creed they did that wonderfully with a separate section of the game that I understand is now used in Greece for educational purposes, and when you enter the game you will be given this option: do you want to be doing that archaeological historic research? And it's very, very in depth. You walk to different areas, you talk to different characters, you access different bits, and you learn all about the country's history. So it's really quite something. Red Dead, it is not as educationally obvious, but you will have all the collectibles, and there are very many for you to pick up. And through those, like cigarette cards, you will get to know more about the locations, the towns, the cities, the performance, the actors, the kind of theatrical plays that were popular, as well as some individuals like gunslingers and doctors and kind of legendary characters. And Pinkertons, for instance, we've heard about Pinkertons through westerns and graphic novels, but very few people will be very familiar with what these guys actually represented in those days. Why is it that the state, the US government, did not have their own force that would be chasing all the outlaws from the Wild West? So, these are very, very interesting elements that everybody can be exploring further. But I'll give you a bit of a rundown, first of all, on the game, because I find that the game is one of those wonderful open world creations where once you enter the massive big open world, you are entertained, you're exploring, you are an active participant, and you kind of blend in with everything that you can find. That includes the environment, it includes various locations, obviously several characters, and you create relationships with many different people in there, which will bring you into a mindset of an individual who actually lived through that era of history. They're trying to make that as close as possible to that era. You will see in the dialogue, in everything that they developed, is very much kind of brought to life in the way they thought it was historically accurate. So, who played Red Dead Redemption 1 years back? Hands up. I'm sure quite a few of us. And just to enlighten you, if you are a great fan of Red Dead overall, you have the option presently for the game to be enjoyed and played on two platforms. One is PlayStation 1, I beg your pardon, it's a PlayStation 4 through the PlayStation streaming services, and you have the game easily accessible through the PS Now, so you just have to go there. It's permanently there, it is not going to be removed, I believe. I mean, there's no date attached to it, and you can literally stream the game through the console and play it back to back. You cannot be downloading it, and therefore it is not going to be streamable on Twitch. But certainly, in order for you to find out what the original world, I should say the first game, looked like, because this one, the Red Dead Redemption 2, is actually a prequel, looked like, so you can just visit it on PS Now services and enjoy everything in full. I played it on the service and it works perfectly well, although sometimes there's a bit of a lag, but that is really quite ignorable considering the volume, the magnitude of the overall game. And this game, the sequel, is presently available on Xbox Game Pass. It is an understanding that the game will be ending on the server of Microsoft later this week. I'm not exactly sure on what date. They were talking about the 7th, but let's wait and see. I've got it downloaded on my console and I'm hoping to play it, you know, as long and as much as possible. So it's very easy to access the content if you want to become more familiar. Secondly, if you're a great fan, then I would most highly recommend that you purchase either on PlayStation or Xbox the Ultimate Edition, because the Ultimate Edition will give you the entire content with its DLCs as well as access to the online services. You know that you probably know that Red Dead Redemption 2 also does have its online presence, and that is an extension of the game. So once you completed the game that you have on your console, the one on physical product or digitally bought, you will be then migrating to the online story, and there's plenty for everyone to do in there. It is a multiplayer and you'll have a lot of fun really doing it. So the Ultimate Edition is always the best bet. Considering that this is one of the biggest and the most successful games of all times, purely in terms of the sales, well, as well as obviously the content and all that we've seen, the game is still offered on a very, very high price. So if you want to be purchasing it on a somewhat reduced and amicable offer, then that will be happening right now before the game disappears from Xbox Game Pass, because you can get it on about 30% off. I think the overall price is about £40, and definitely worth considering. And if you want the Ultimate Edition, you'll have to pay the full price, and there's just presently no way around to that. But I will be waiting until the Ultimate and everything else comes down, and I'll obviously purchase it when it kind of bottoms out, which is usually the way I do it with not just video games but literally everything. I wait for bottoming out, I purchase it, and then obviously I enjoy it in a long term. And I just advise everyone to do the same, but that might be the music to the publishers and developers' ears, because they want to do exactly the opposite. They want everyone to pre-order in order to get everything well in advance, and of course purchase it on a full price. And there is obviously serious logic in that. You really want everybody to be engaging within your product. You want them to be participating, connecting and interacting, and also you want them to be investing, because don't forget these games are costing anything from 70 to about £250 million, and they're really on the level of the AAA Hollywood blockbusters, which means they are very, very expensive to make, and the publisher really needs to get some of that money back as soon as possible. On the other hand, if you have a quality content like what we obviously were given here, the investment is going to be fully justified. I just like my own kind of trader's mindset, in everything, and I have a very large collection of video games, graphic novels, DVDs, CDs, laserdiscs, books, and many other items which I had bought and collected over the years. And if you came in, you would have assumed that I was a multimillionaire, but actually all of that was being bought through various kinds of trade offers and really on very low prices. For instance, when the Laserdisc market was going downhill after the DVDs were invented, I bought everything from one of the largest distributors in the US and ended up with about 2,000 Laserdiscs. Each one of them was costing anything from 10 cents to about $5 compared to the previous prices that were varying from $20 to about 300. So you get basically the idea. Anyway, coming back to Red Dead Redemption. So what is this game overall? Why is it that the developer of Grand Theft Auto, the game that was again considered to be one of the most popular during the last 2 decades, they kind of went into the history of the Wild West? Well, I'll tell you why. Because they wanted to create an action-adventure game, which indeed was one of the trademarks of Rockstar Studios, and the game that we have been entertaining, the sequel, is basically the third entry in the Red Dead series. And also, very importantly, I think it's very important for the new gamers to know this, it is a prequel to the 2010 game, right? So if you were playing the Red Dead 1, that actually is happening after the events of the sequel. So that's an ingenious concept. They really wanted people to come in and enjoy the sequel and then revisit the original game, which is exactly what I did. And if you played the game on its release 10 years ago, you would have forgotten some of the parts of it, and but you'd have remembered the overall flavor. And many people then, if they wanted to do it on their state-of-the-art latest consoles, PS4 and Xbox One, would have probably purchased it yet again. But as said, it was not necessary in recent months, as this one was available through Xbox Game Pass, and the original is easily accessible through PS Now services. So keep this in mind if you are wanting to revisit instead of just dishing out all the money. But obviously, if you want to get the Ultimate Editions, there is going to be no alternative. You'll have to purchase them. So yeah, this is a prequel to the 2010 game Red Dead Redemption. The story is set in 1899 in a fictionalized representation of the Western, Midwestern and Southern United States. And in this game we follow outlaw Arthur Morgan, and he is a member of the Van der Linde gang, a very, very nasty group of outlaws, as probably you would have been more than familiar if you played the game. And Arthur must deal with the decline of the Wild West, which is happening in 1899, turn of the century in the US, whilst attempting to survive against government forces, rival gangs, and all other kinds of adversaries. Sometimes they include animals. The other day we were chasing a grizzly and nearly got killed. The grizzly got away and we didn't get any rewards. So there you go. And afterwards I was chasing the grizzly and I couldn't find him anywhere. So grizzly just disappeared. I unloaded about a dozen bullets, and I think I used the wrong weapon. I didn't have my Winchester, just used my pistol, and therefore grizzly did not fall. So the story also follows other gang members, most notably the other from the original game, whose name is John Marston, the protagonist of the original Red Dead Redemption, and you will be familiar with him. If you are entering the online section, you are going to be able to choose him to be the protagonist. You will choose a male or female character, and he's going to be the male one. The game is presented through both first and third person perspectives, so the choice is yours. Basically, I much prefer third person perspective in here. And the player can also freely roam in its interactive open world, which I have to say is massive. It is on the same level as, for instance, the ones in Assassin's Creed or in Fallout or in Oblivion or Skyrim or Anthem, or all the games where you are given the opportunity to explore everything that is out there. And it is full of surprises, it's full of collectibles, and full of all kinds of adversaries, so therefore you should really be prepared for everything and anything. And equally, if you are engaging, well, if you see anybody riding a horse or walking around, I advise you always to talk to them as much as you can. You will have to be deciding how you want to play the character. He's an outlaw, so you can play him as an outlaw, being really bad and being mean, and there will be consequences to what you do. Or you can probably try to kind of make up for all the bad deeds that he had completed and play him on a more kind of noble level, and therefore the outcome is going to be significantly different. So the choice is yours. And so basically he then, the gameplay elements will be including quite a variety of activities. You have shootouts, you have heists, you have hunting, horseback riding, interacting with non-player characters, and also maintaining the character's honor rating through moral choices and deeds. So it's quite important. You will be getting some degree of recognition for everything you do, and that'll be indeed represented through those honor ratings. A bounty system similar to the wanted system from the Grand Theft Auto franchise governs the response of law enforcement and bounty hunters to crimes committed by the player. So don't remember, if you are, for instance, thieving, or if you are killing, or if you're robbing, anytime you go to any of those settlements, there will be a bounty on your head, and you'll be facing many adversaries. So in fact, your gameplay is going to be fairly hairy. And the game's development began quite soon after the Red Dead Redemption's release, and that was in view of its success, obviously, and was shared between all Rockstar Studios worldwide. So it wasn't just done within one vicinity. The development team drew influence from real locations as opposed to film or art, also focused on creating an accurate reflection of the time with the game's characters and the world. We look in depth, very shortly into this, because I have quite a big analysis on what types of events and characters were represented in here. But initially we'll just look at the game, so if you bear with me, we'll get back to the history very shortly. And so they wanted to make it as authentic and as real as possible. So I think they really absolutely excelled. It's one of the most authentic period pieces I've ever played within the world of video gaming. So we have the game was Rockstar's first build specifically for 8th generation consoles. So all of that, inclusive of engines, was kind of geared towards it. Having tested the technical capabilities while porting Grand Theft Auto 5 to the platforms, and you will be familiar with the fact that the GTA 5 was accessible through Xbox Game Pass and PS Now services as well. So if you're interested, you can presently purchase it, but previously you could have played them live and streamed them to those servers. The game's soundtracks features an original score composed by Willie Jackson and several vocal tracks produced by Daniel Lanois. So really very good soundtrack. I think you will get some of that if you are purchasing one of those premium editions, so keep this in mind. It's always a kind of a great add-on and something to treasure. Red Dead Redemption 2 was released for the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One in October 2018, and for Microsoft Windows and Stadia in November of 2019, which is basically a year later. Red Dead Online, the online multiplayer mode in the game, was released as a beta version in November of 2018 before its full release 6 months later in May of 2019. So the game was widely anticipated and marketed massively before release. We've seen loads of trailers and adverts and everything. The game actually broke many records and had the second biggest launch in the history of entertainment, generating $725,000 in sales from its opening weekend. To be precise, $725 million, right? So it's nearly $750,000 in sales from its opening weekend, and exceeding the lifetime sales of Red Dead Redemption in 2 weeks. It was extraordinary. I mean, consider that the Red Dead Redemption 1 was sold for 8 years prior to this, and they actually managed to catch up with the sales of 8 years within less than 2 weeks, for 10 days to be precise. So remember, I followed the news, and I mean, it's staggering. I mean, considering it's a very expensive game, but the attention, the popularity, and the demand was incredible. So $725 million made in 3 days breaks all entertainment records. Face the facts. I'm not sure whether the Avengers Black Panther, the film, would have broken it. I don't think it did. I think they had very successful sales, but I don't think they've reached nearly, they didn't reach that level of sales within a couple of days And what made it possible in this instance is a combination of pre-orders together with digital downloads, because the vast majority of people who are ordering on the first weekend, probably more than 90%, were buying it as a digital download, so it's easy access. You purchase, you download, you play. It's a lengthy download, would have taken a few hours, but nevertheless it was already on your system and you could just simply crack on. And that is the model that the industry is pursuing at the moment. It's pre-orders and digital downloads as early as possible. Don't forget, 10 years ago, when we were wanting to play the original game, what we did was we went to a local shop and we queued up before midnight, because literally 1 minute after midnight, the gates would open, and therefore we were more than able to get in and collect our favorite game. And many people were queuing up for quite a few hours, believe you me. I remember the queues for the games like Assassin's Creed and Call of Duty and what was it, Mass Effect, and Bioshock was a very, very popular one. And so these times are long gone, because people will be pre-ordering and getting the digital downloads. So that is the reason as to why the game was so successful, in addition to its quality and a massive, very expensive marketing campaign. So it receives initially very critical acclaim and praise directed as its story, characters, open world graphics, and considerable level of detail. So everybody was very happy with this. Don't forget, if you are playing the game on your very kind of expensive top-notch gaming rig, your top-notch computer, you are going to be getting the very best of graphics. But to tell you the truth, if you also are doing a game on Xbox One X and it is connected to your 4K or one of the latest state-of-the-art TVs, on 60 or up to 80-inch screen size, you will have a fantastically immersive experience. Every single detail is absolutely razor sharp and fully visible. You'll be able to soak up even a snake, a mosquito, a fly, or a rabbit as they're kind of lurking in the background. Some minor criticism was directed at its control scheme and emphasis on realism over player freedom. I actually didn't encounter any of this during my gameplay. Considered as an example of video games as an art form, it won many accolades, inclusive of Game of the Year awards from several publications, and it is amongst the best-selling video games of all time, with over 32 million copies shipped. So 32 million copies shipped during the initial period is absolutely staggering. It's a wonderful achievement. So we'll look a bit at the actual gameplay, the gameplay of Red Dead Redemption 2, and maybe we'll compare it with the original. You will immediately find that the overall experience is a lot smoother on the visual front. The controls are working a lot better, the characters are more placid. It is that rigidity which you've had sometimes with the horse turning around, and some of the actions in the original are completely gone, and you really feel that everything is blending in very, very perfectly. No wonder, as they started the work immediately after the original game was released, and they were specifically targeting the engines for the new next generation consoles, so everything worked perfectly. And the delivery was absolutely spot on. I've not heard any complaints at all about the tech for the game. I've heard some issues related to the online, but don't forget, the online is something completely different. And obviously it's a multiplayer. It is done on a server, which means that you are having lots of people coming in, and therefore the presence of a great number of gamers may well be causing lags or delays and various other things, which sometimes can happen, particularly during the initial couple of weeks where everybody wants to get in. And it's human psychology, my friends. Everyone is having all of their childhood drives reawakened. I want my ice cream first. I want my cake before my siblings, and that's exactly as to why people want to be amongst the first to get the game. I mean, just have a look at the streamers. When you have a game, brand new, top-notch, blockbuster game released like The Last of Us 2, 1 minute after midnight, and there are these streams. And I know it's competitive and they want to draw attention in order to get new subscribers and all this, but it is driven by that degree of curiosity. I got in there first. For myself, I quite like the idea of going to many live events. You know, when you have red carpet galas where you have stars of a particular film, a major film, interviewed live on stage, participating. To give an example, The Cold Mountain, Anthony Minghell's film with Jude Law and Nicole Kidman and Renée Zellweger. It's a big royal gala just before Christmas in London, and I was there, and it was quite a spectacular event, because once in a lifetime you can really see everybody in real life, and it was a very, very friendly, very it's a very beautiful royal gala where the aura of friendliness and connectivity was present everywhere. And I really think this was very much to do with the film director. He was a very, very nice, very chatty, very sociable and friendly gentleman. Sadly, he died suddenly a few years later, and we were absolutely shocked to learn of his passing. I'm not exactly sure what the circumstances were, but coming back to the premiere, this was also a film that's very similar to Red Dead Redemption. It's a film about those times in the Wild West, and I liked being there on the night, being a participant in something which I consider to be fairly monumental. And that is the drive that many people, particularly younger generations, have towards the games when they're being released. Don't forget, you will get also developer diaries, you will get interviews and many other things happening at the same time. So somebody entering that world and connecting with the game as well as with the guys who created it maybe 24 hours in advance is always felt as a privilege. So let's have a look at the gameplay in Red Dead, and let's see what happens in the sequel. So the sequel is a Western-themed action-adventure game. It's played from a first or third-person perspective. The game is set in an open-world environment, and it's featuring a fully fictionalized version of the Western, Midwestern, and Southern United States in 1899, so it's the turn of the century. And it is literally focused on the latter half of the Wild West era and the turn of the 20th century. So the game features both single player and online multiplayer components, and the latter was released under Red Dead Online banner. For most of the game, the player will control Arthur Morgan compared to the other character, John Marston, in the original game, and he's a member of the Van der Linde gang, as he completes numerous missions, linear scenarios with set objectives to progress through the story. So the campaign is actually told in a linear fashion. We have lots of sub-quests as well. From the game's epilogue, the player controls John Marston, the playable protagonist of the game's predecessor, Red Dead Redemption. Outside of missions, the player may freely roam the game's interactive world, and there's plenty to find in there. As I said earlier, it's very, very vast, and you need to talk to every single character, you need to engage with every single person, and particularly if you're traveling to certain settlements, you can chat with them. Some of them will talk to you back, you'll trigger off some cutscenes. You do not have the dialogue which is similar to Mass Effect or Anthem, where you will be choosing different kinds of questions and answers, but nevertheless it is very, very rich with content, and also depending on who you talk to, you'll be unlocking certain missions and getting some of those cutscenes. The player may engage in combat with enemies using melee attacks, firearms, throwables, or indeed explosives. You collect dynamites. Combat has been refined from the game's predecessor. It's much advanced in my experience, and a notable few mechanics consist of dual wielding and the ability to use a bow. I've used the bow quite a lot. It's very useful if you're hunting animals. The player is granted the ability to swim as Arthur, but not as John, a reference to the previous game where swimming led to instant death. So that's quite cool, because obviously the aura of the previous game is very much present in here. Red Dead Redemption 2 Unexploited Land makes up the largest portion of the game world and features diverse landscapes with occasional travelers, bandits, and wildlife. There are urban settlements in the game, ranging from farmhouses to towns and cities. In fact, when you are traveling through the wild, you will sometimes find a farm which is remotely situated and the one that is currently under a major attack. So you'll always join in and help, or indeed you will attack it together with the bandits, depending on what side of his character you want to play. So remember that, but explore everything and talk to everyone. Horses are the main forms of transportation, which is purely natural, as there were no cars at the time, of which there are various breeds, each with different attributes. The player can steal horses and must either train or tame a wild horse to use it. To own a horse, you must be saddled or stabled. So increased use of a horse will begin a bonding process, which can be increased by cleaning and feeding, and the player will acquire advantages as they ride the horse. So stagecoaches and trains can also be used to travel, so it's quite useful if you're on foot. You just jump on a train, but just don't forget sometimes this may be a bit hairy in view of some of the people that are present on those trains. And the player can hijack an incoming train or stagecoach by threatening the driver or passengers and then rob its contents of the passengers. So quite frankly, this is a massive game. You can spend many months doing everything, particularly if you are a completionist and a collector. And don't forget, if you do it on a first run as a real bad guy, so you do everything wrong, you loot, you rob, you kill, you attack, you hijack various transports, you hijack some of the stagecoaches, and you go through the settlements and take everything away from the inhabitants. But in addition to that, you can be then replaying the game and focus on the good deeds. So your skills tree will be responding to that, and you'll be getting some thumbs up, and you get significantly different activity within the game. So also when you do it, you may also witness or take part in random events which you encounter from exploring the game world, and they could include ambushes, the one I mentioned, crimes committed by other people, so you'll discover that somebody else got killed and you will be able to report it, pleas for assistance, ride-by shootings, public executions, and animal attacks. In fact, there will be several of your gang members being lined up for execution, and then you'll have to rescue them. For example, as the player explores the Wild West, they can find specific people in distress. If the player decides to help them, they will be thankful and may reward the player if they cross them again. So you'll get some rewards. I've already helped several people here during our gameplay in Red Dead. The player may also take part in side activities, which include small tasks with companions and strangers, dueling sometimes, bounty hunting, searching for treasure or other collectibles around the map, such as rock carvings, and playing poker. Also playing blackjack, dominoes, and five-finger fillet. Be very careful with that one, because obviously you can cut yourself, and this may well be affecting your ability to shoot. Hunting animals also play a major role in the game, providing food, income, and materials for crafting items. When hunting, the player needs to take into account several factors, and they include the choice of weapon and shot placement, which affect the quality of the meat and pelt, and subsequently the price of traders are willing to pay. That's very important, so keep this in mind. The player can either skin the animal immediately or carry the carcass, which will rot over time and decrease its value and attract predators. Also, what's important, once you are catching animals like rabbits, you can cook them and you can eat them, and that will be enhancing your abilities. So remember that, that's very, very important. And frequently, if you have a camp, you are going to be able to enjoy some of that freshly cooked food and then get fully replenished. The game focuses heavily on your choices, both for the story and the missions. So you have certain moments in the story that will give the player the option to accept or decline additional missions, and lightly shape the plot around their choices. My personal preference is always engage with everything, and therefore get the very best content. If you're cutting corners, doing speed runs, the content will be massively reduced, and you really don't want that. You have to be investing time and effort in Red Dead 2, and also you have to be doing everything precisely, diligently, with an eye for collections. So you collect different types of items, you bring them to your inventory, and you really want to be doing everything at all times. So no speed runs, because obviously for a game of this magnitude, any form of speed run will just spoil the enjoyment. The player can communicate with any non-player character in dynamic ways, which is quite new to the series, and that was not possible in the original. So you can choose a different type of dialogue trees with NPCs, such as having a friendly chat or insulting them. It's actually basically two different options. If the player chooses to kill an NPC, they can loot the corpse, so you can steal everything that they have on them. The Red Dead 2 brings back the honor system from its predecessor by measuring how the player's actions are perceived in terms of morality, and that's the kind of the honor system is going to be very, very important, and you really have to be choosing one side of the character. Be, if you want to be good, then you need to be literally good throughout. If you want to be playing as bad, be bad throughout. If you're swinging from one to another, then that will be affecting the type of content that is being received, and I personally don't like swinging it. I like being either one or the other throughout the whole gameplay, and then that ensures another replay at a later date. Morally positive choices and deeds like helping strangers, abiding the law, and sparing opponents in a duel will add up to the player's honor. And negative deeds such as theft and harming innocents will subtract from the player's honor as well. So the story is influenced by honor, as the dialogue and outcomes of the player will differ, and they'll be based on their honor levels. Hitting milestones for the player's honor level will grant unique benefits, such as rewarding the player with special outfits and large discounts in stores. So remember that if you want to be having special outfits and large discounts, you need to be playing that character as honorable. A low honor level is also beneficial, as you will receive a greater number of items from looted corpses. Either or, if you are bad, you're looting, you are accumulating wealth and materials, and you can use them for your other treacherous deeds. So, you are going to be rewarded either way, but my personal preference is always to go for the low levels of the honor tree. Honor levels. Maintaining Arthur and John is important, as they can undergo conditions that affect their health and stamina. So in addition to a health and stamina bar, the player also has scores which affect the rate at which the health and stamina regenerate. For example, you wear warmer clothes, and that will mean you avoid freezing in a cold environment, but wearing them in a hot environment will result in perspiration. So you've got to be thinking as you have both seasonal and day and night changes, and you really need to be always equipping your character appropriately. Freezing or overheating will rapidly drain cores. The character will tell you whether you are hot, cold, whether you need to eat, and when they tell you this, you need to take action immediately. An overweight character will be able to better absorb damage, but will have less stamina. Obviously, you will not be able to run very fast. The player can eat and sleep to replenish their cores. It's funny, isn't it? Because if you're eating quite a lot, you'll get fat, and that's one of the very few games that has this. Well, obviously to this extent, which is visible and a kind of an element that will be affecting your choices and the overall outcome. With weapons requiring cleaning to maintain the performance as well, so keep that gun oil on you at all times and make sure you clean your weapons, particularly when you pick them up for the first time. You've got to clean them properly, as if you would if you were in a real life situation. Anyone who is familiar with the military, they'll tell you there is never ever any time to relax. When you're seated, you have to be oiling your weapon. It's just the basic rule, and as to why that is. So they become more experienced with it, which improves weapon handling, reduces recoil, and will also increase the rate of reloading. Well, amongst other things, gunfights are an essential mechanic in this game. The player can take cover, free aim, target a person or animal, and individual body parts can also be targeted to take targets down without actually killing them. So that is dependent on what type of character you are meeting. If you're being jumped by bandits who want to rob you, you will be going obviously for a straight kill. If you have a situation where something completely unexpected took place, you'll be aiming for their arms and legs, and then you'll find out for yourself basically as to why they were doing it. So very, very useful, really, for all of us to embrace. And let's see, individual body parts can be targeted when the player shoots an enemy. The game's AR reactions and movements depend on where they were hit. Weapons can aim for head, basically, if you want to have a straight kill. And it is quite difficult if the enemy is at some distance, and the aim in here is not really very precise. It's a bit like what you would expect if you were living in the Wild West, so that's all very well aligned with the weaponry of the era. It's not like Ghost Recon weapons, for obvious reason, because the weapons were not that advanced in those days. Weapons consist of pistols, revolvers, repeaters, rifles, shotguns, bows, explosives, lassos, mounted guns, and melee weapons such as knives and tomahawks. So it's quite a variety for you to choose from. Make sure you use an appropriate weapon in a situation that requires it. So for instance, if you want to be attacking a bear, well, you can try with bow and arrow, but grizzly will be much stronger than that. And if you're looking at rabbits or deer, bow and arrow will be very useful if you aim for the head, if you're a hunter. I don't really like hunting, so I'm just as necessary activity here to get some rewards. Otherwise, I like animals, and therefore I would not really use the weapons on them as much. The game brings back the trademark mechanic in the franchise as well, which is called Deadeye. And this is a targeting system that will be allowing you, the player, to slow down time and mark targets. Once the targeting sequence ends, the player fires to every marked location in a very short space of time. So it's down to preference. I mean, I don't actually like using it. I use the Deadeye here in order to track certain enemies and certain characters, rather than to slow down action. I think the action sequences, many of which are here ending in gunfights, are very exciting, and slowing them down is not really my kind of jazz. And obviously slowing them down will help you to target somebody more precisely, but it's down to your own preference. Deadeye system upgrades as the player progresses in the game, and will also grant the player more abilities, such as being able to spot the fatal points of the enemies. It's very useful, really, if you're looking for a bear or looking for some sort of prey. They left some sort of tracks in snow, or they walk through mud. If you use the Deadeye, you'll be able to see it. It's highlighted in yellow, and therefore it'll be easier to find them. If you don't like Deadeye, then you can simply stroll and look for them. You will still find them. It will take a bit more time. The bounty system returns from Red Dead as well, the original, a crime governing mechanic inspired by GTA, wanted system. You remember that was wanted system in GTA if you played it. And when a player commits a crime, witnesses run to the nearest police station to get the law to intervene, and the player needs to stop the witness to avoid repercussions. So that's quite difficult in towns and cities. They're very, very close to sheriff's office, but if you're in the wild, they want to report something, then you can really leg it and chase them, or you can jump on a horse if they're walking, and obviously on a horse you'll be able to catch up with them much quicker. So it's similar to what you have in other games with jumping on a jeep and doing some wider distances relatively fast. And after committing enough crime, the US Marshals will be sent to the player location, which means there will be a posse chasing you. To escape law enforcement, the player must evade a red circular zone in the map, and then the wanted meter will slowly deplete, so they can alternatively hide from the pursuers or kill them, depending on your player preference. Whether the player escapes or gets captured, the bounty will remain on the head. Lawmen and civilians will be more vigilant, and the regions where the crimes have been committed will be in a lockdown. When caught by lawmen, the player has the opportunity to surrender if they are unarmed and on foot. The bounty hunters will not accept surrender if the player is known to slip out of apprehension attempts. So it's quite clever, really, on the AI front, and you need to be thinking as you play the game literally throughout. The player can only remove their bounty by paying it off at a post office. So that's always a possibility, and you will have some money on you, and then you try to pay it off. Right, so we are now coming to what we said we'd analyze in depth, and that is the world of Red Dead Redemption 2, and as to why this world has been so properly researched, and how deeply does it really represent the history of the US. So it spans around 5 fictitious US states. So these states are New Hanover, and Barina, and Lemoyne, and are new to the series. All are located to the immediate north and east of the previous world, whilst the states of New Austin and West Elizabeth return from Red Dead Redemption. It's exactly the same. The states are centered on the San Luis and Lanaheshi rivers and the shores of Flatiron Lake. So Ambarina is a mountain wilderness, with the largest settlement being a Native American reservation, New Hanover is a wide valley that has become a hub of industry and is home to the cattle town of Valentine. You'll be visiting Valentine very frequently. Lemoyne is composed of basin plantations resembling Louisiana. Also is home to the southern town of Rhodes and the former French colony of Saint-Denis, which is really quite analogous to New Orleans. So you get the idea, this is your American South, and there are many resemblances and reference points, but didn't want to offend anyone, therefore it is fictitious. And this is very wise. You'll remember that Ubisoft work on Ghost Recon Breakpoint, and they located it in a real life situation in Bolivia, the country that exists within its borders, and they scouted the regions and the areas, and then the whole story was basically completely fictitious. It didn't work out because the government of Bolivia got very upset and concerned that the country was presented as highly corrupt, operating as a major drug den, and they also felt that with its popularity it was affecting the number of visitors that would come to the country, and particularly those who would like mountain trekking and never ever dare to go to any areas because they've seen, you know, this kind of drug activity and all of those unpleasantries in the game. So obviously the Rockstar Studios, Rockstar Games, had taken a very different lead, and they wanted to make everything fictitious with some reference points, which I think is very good, wise and soothing compared to the other. You'll recall that Ghost Recon Breakpoint, no, it's actually I gave you some wrong information. It's not Breakpoint, it is Wildlands. Breakpoint is the latest game, and due to the problems they had with Wildlands, they indeed introduced a fictitious environment. So they were taught a lesson, and that was basically the difference. West Elizabeth here in Red Dead consists of wide plains, dense forests, and the modern town of Blackwater. So this region has been explained from the original Red Dead Redemption to include a vast northern portion containing the small town of Strawberry. New Austin is an arid desert region centered on the frontier towns of Armadillo and Tumbleweed, and featured in the original game. New Austin is an arid desert region centered on the frontier towns of Armadillo and Tumbleweed, and parts of New Austin and West Elizabeth have been redesigned to reflect the earlier time. For example, Blackwater is still under development, while Armadillo has become a ghost town because of a major cholera outbreak. You will also see that medicine and doctors were not accessible in those days as much, and therefore lots of characters will get contaminated with some dreadful diseases, and they will die as a result. So it's very important to remember that everything in here is based on some degree of historic accuracy. So we've seen that this is basically the environment, and now we'll be looking at how accurate really the game is to the real Wild West. We've heard that we largely use fictional people and places, but for a game with mainly made-up lead characters, it also could be surprising to some people to learn that Red Dead Redemption 2 does stay true to historic accuracy. So despite the fact that it's a fictitious environment, it does have its reference points. So you will be assuming the role of John Marston in the first one, and he will be tracking his former associates, and you remember what happened in there. And in the second game, it's obviously Arthur Morgan. So this game is a prequel, and we have all these hoodlums really belonging to the Van der Linde gang, as mentioned earlier, and we also learn how they eventually disbanded and also provide a deeper look into the Wild West of the late 19th century. The Van der Linde gang was a real gang. They did exist, and they're represented here in a way which is fictitious, but their behavior and the robberies and everything else is very much sort of close to what these guys were doing many years ago, more than 100 years ago, 121 years ago to be precise. And the game presents us with this concept, which is basically fictitious environment following the real leads, the actual real life situations, in order to be more immersive and impressive. And also it speaks to the sheer amount of effort that the developer Rockstar was indeed putting into creating this wonderful adventure game. And it's actually clear to see that many people from the industry hailed this game to be one of the biggest masterpieces of video gaming ever created. I agree with them. It will take you a bit of time to blend in with the environment where you do it on the first run. There's a lot to learn, and specifically for those people who have not played the original. But as you carry on, you play different chapters, you will become more and more embedded within this world, and you'll enjoy the characters and the story. There are many things to be done. There's two different parts, one which is told in a linear fashion, and the other with side quests, which is sort of trickling along and moving away from the basic story. So it depends on how you want to do it. I'd say pursue the campaign and the story first of all, and any time there are any other side quests popping up on your map or in your inventory, because you have to combine the two, you need to do them straight away. They'll always pop up on your map. They'll be highlighted with kind of yellow blots, and you can then investigate them further. The conflicts encountered in the game are very accurate for the times. The Vanderlins were inspired by real-life outlaws, and basically they'd drawn comparisons with Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch, and they've been immortalized in many films. You might have seen Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, which is a very, very famous film with Paul Newman and Robert Redford, or you might have seen Sam Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch, that has a group of outlaws that rob banks and cause mayhem, a very violent, very brutal western, which was highly controversial at the time of its release. And I think if there's one thing about Red Dead, it does make you go back to the film history, and it kind of draws you to certain films that you perhaps heard of but never watched, and now is the best time really to get them on Blu-ray and basically stick them in your console and watch them literally from beginning to end. Highly recommend those two, Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, as well as The Wild Bunch, but you may well be also wanting to watch Sergio Leone's films, most importantly Once Upon a Time in the West, which I believe is very, very aligned. I should say this game is very aligned with that film, because you have this massive big open world in there. The settlements, the characters are very similar to what you have here. So there's one major influence on the game in terms of audio visuals, that certainly would be Sergio Leone's masterpiece. So if you try out these three, you can progress to My Darling Clementine, John Ford's masterpiece with real-life characters played by Henry Fonda and Victor Mature. And then you can also have a look at The Searchers with John Wayne and very young Natalie Wood, one of the westerns that's been labelled the very best one of all times. Well, down to the preference. My favourite western of all times is The Winnings of Barbara Worth, and that in fact superseded My Darling Clementine, which was holding the trophy until the point where Henry King's western was seen a few years back. Excuse me. Both are absolutely remarkable, so you have a chance. Winnings of Barbara Worth is your best bet, and you can very easily watch it on YouTube. The restoration print is easily accessible in there. You will recall that the silent films do not have any license or copyrights, and therefore they're easily found on the streaming platforms, the free stream platforms on the internet. So if you have a chance, you have a choice amongst those 6 films. You will have, I'll repeat them again, first of all 2 which are aligned to this film, to this game, Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, and then you have The Wild Bunch. After that you can progress to the older films like My Darling Clementine, Stagecoach, I didn't mention, another wonderful John Ford western, Winnings of Barbara Worth, and also maybe Red River. That's Howard Hawks' masterpiece with John Wayne and Montgomery Clift. You can also be entering the world of The Iron Horse, John Ford's silent western, really kind of done on an epic scale, and again very much blending in with the world here, and also with the world of Once Upon a Time in the West, because they're basically building the railroad, and all the activities are kind of situated around the areas where they are, when they are sort of doing the major maintenance and railways work, and that is really one of the masterpieces of the silent film history. So definitely worth revisiting. The list goes on and on, but I think if you really have a look at these films, you will have a very, very good picture of what the Wild West was like on the silver screen, and you'll get some reference points in relation to Red Dead Redemption 2. We've heard that the characters in the Vanderlins are similar to Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch, and we have other factions in the game that will have roots in history. Angelo Bronte's mafia in Saint Denis, for instance, parallels the Sicilian mob family that had a hold over the New Orleans in that particular part of American history. So remember that. So it's Angelo Bronte's mafia in Saint Denis compared to the Sicilian mob family in New Orleans, because Saint Denis basically is your New Orleans, which is not called, with its proper title. And at one point in Red Dead Redemption 2's story, Arthur finds himself involved in a protest for women's suffrage. So, although women didn't get the right to vote in the US until 1920, the movement was picking up traction by the end of the 1800s. So there were some campaigners already in 1895, and therefore there is a reference point in here to do with it. So it was more than fitting for them to be including a nod to the influential movement. Similarly, the Pinkertons, the detectives, the private detective agency. In fact, I heard of Pinkertons through two different sources. One was the Western films, but even more so, I've heard about them through Belgian Western comic strips and graphic novels. Anyone who read Lucky Luke will remember that they had Pinkertons chasing various outlaws in there at all times. So, Pinkertons really kind of sprung up in graphic novels, and this is how I got to know about them. And guess what? Many other gamers of the younger generation will do exactly the same. They will not be reading Lucky Luke, but they'll be playing Red Dead Redemption and hear about Pinkertons. In fact, Pinkertons are mentioned right at the beginning, and Vanderlin's gang is rather worried that they infiltrated some of the towns and cities, and therefore it's much better if they create the settlements further away from some of those urban settings. So hear about the Pinkertons quite a bit. And the beauty of it is, if you are finding a reference point on cigarette cards that are collected in a game, you can go to Google and then research it most thoroughly. You get all the information, become really truly educational. In fact, they really should do a DLC that will be full of cutscenes or various kind of excerpts where in fact you can learn more about these characters. Maybe at some point in the future they will do that, depending on interest, but considering they made so much money by the sales of the game, it would be, for me, both just logical and on the other hand highly educational, and perhaps even then used in the US in the same way as they've done in Greece with Assassin's Creed Odyssey. So Pinkerton's agency was another source of conflict that was alive and well in the real Wild West. So the detective agency was very frequently hired by the government or other private actors to bring justice to the West, and often this would include hunting down outlaws like the Vanderlyn gang. They also really exposed the racial inequalities well, and these were prominent for the time, and not just in the part of the game where Arthur can go crazy on a bunch of Ku Klux Klan members. Parts of Red Dead 2 storyline also are built around the conflict between the US government and the Wapiti Reservation. So the former wants to seize the land in order to further American interests, but the Native Americans were understandably unwilling to let their territory go. So there is a parallel with a variety of similar conflicts that happened between the US government and the natives at the end of the 19th century. So it's very important, and you will be able to pick this up as you carry on in the game. There are certain references made in the dialogue in particular, and then you will end up in certain situations where this is more than visible. And I guess this is a part of American history that many consider slightly unsavory. But on the other hand, it's basically part of the history, and it is factual. So therefore, representing in the game was, more than fitting. And it says here that the situation is remarkably evocative of at least two particular historic situations, and that's to do with race relations and the Native Americans. The famous government seizure of the Black Hills from the Plains Nations after discovery of gold in the 1870s. So as soon as the gold was discovered, the inhabitants had to be simply gone, and the territory was seized. And then the patronizing and reprehensible treatment of the Osage by the state and federal governments through the 1920s. So these are the references and the research that some of our friends from IGN did, and I'm very grateful for that, because I personally would have not known of those incidents, and these are represented and reflected on here in the game. So on the other hand, the game is really visually beautifully accurate. We have many different representations of that era, and what better way to find out what people like but by looking at their armor or their outfits. You can see that they're being dressed in a fashion that is very much aligned with that era, and their weapons are more than perfectly created for that period of American history. And so if we look at the weapons, we want to provide an accurate portrayal of the gun section outlaws, which they would have had in the real West. So if you are a major weapons fan, which is what I'm not, you'll be able to research each one of those weapons that the character is likely to use. And many of the models available are directly based on guns popular at the turn of the century. The kind of repeating rifle, for instance, is a staple of the Wild West in media and literature. We've seen that many, many times. The Winchesters, basically, the Winchester was a major weapon in there. It's a repetition weapon that enabled particularly the hunters, to succeed, and gave them a lot more time really to attack the prey. And they were one of the earliest repeaters available on the market, and very advanced at the time. And also the other one was Lancaster, one of the most effective guns in the game, and it largely embodies the famous rifle, the Lancaster rifle, of course. You remember the Lancaster planes later in human history, the Second World War. What is inaccurate about the weapons in here is the reload time. In reality, most pistols were not loaded to full capacity because of the major risk of accident, given how volatile the guns could be, and also people not trained to handle weapons overall. It was a commodity just like any other. You could own a bottle of whiskey or a rabbit and as many weapons as you wanted, but you didn't have a training on what to do with these weapons, compared to the training given to how you're going to hunt a bear. It's just the basics. If you want to be handling the weapon correctly, you need to be psychologically and physically and practically equipped and trained on how to use a weapon, because being in possession of it does have many, many consequences for the person who is the owner. And that's the way it is in real life. So if you were in the armed forces, you will remember your weapon drills and everything else in order to train you how to use the weapon in an environment where basically you will be applying so-called controlled aggression. But in no circumstances would you want to use that in a different environment, which obviously would be in a civic situation, and the training and the drills will absolutely drill you into this. You will be really very skilled on how to use a weapon. That is what was lacking at the time here in the world of the Wild West, and you will find that many people had caused accidents and shot some of their mates and gang members due to the lack of training and the inability to know how to handle the weaponry. So the other thing was that they would leave a couple of chambers empty to prevent accidents. So just think about it. If you had 6 chambers, 2 empty, 4 bullets in there, if you missed on 3, obviously you'll be having a very hairy day out. The environments here are very, very accurate. Whilst the cities are to a degree fictional, we can see also how they took inspiration from Hudson River School in recreating the landscapes, also in order to present an accurate depiction of what the environment looked like in the Old West. So unlike some Western themed video games, which are completely devoid of reality, the real Wild West here certainly does feel very much alive and close to real life. And the 19th century American art movement, so you will be collecting cigarette cards with some of those in the game, was heavily influenced by Romanticism in Europe and focused on natural beauty such as mountains, rivers and foliage. Many wonderful landscapes were produced, and you will see that on various items that are collectible here in the game. Beautifully represented. You learn both about the pieces of art as well as the artists, and I urge everyone to be researching, collecting and exploring any area they find themselves in, regardless of where they are, whether you're doing the open world or whether you are in one of those buildings in any of the settlements. And well, there's a bit of a spoiler in here. I'm not going to give you about one of the characters. and anytime somebody dies is basically a reflection of the sad fates that many people encountered in the 19th century due to a lack of medical knowledge and care, and tuberculosis, TB, was running rampant amid the Americas during the time, but a lack of medical treatments just worsened the symptoms. And nowadays the rates of death from TB are drastically improved, even though many people around the world still continue to suffer from this disease in the areas of the world where there isn't proper medical care. Rockstar's team really took historical accuracy to heart and delivered this wonderful game that stays true to history while providing an unforgettable gaming experience. And I think I would really absolutely agree with the references, and I'll just give you a bit more on the game development and the reception, and then we'll call it a day for today. It's turned out to be a lengthy podcast. I thought I was going to be able to tell you in 45 minutes all about the game, but similar to what we experience as we enter the open world, we have a very major selection of descriptions, and the game is vast, and therefore our explorative description here also turned out to be a bit lengthier than expected, so hopefully you were able to follow me and enjoy some of the descriptions, and if not, you can just simply rewind on playback and get involved. So we've heard that they've taken so much time in order to present us with that degree of historic accuracy, but what was the actual development of this game like? It's a question on what they had to do initially. And we've heard that their preliminary work on the sequel began during the development of the original game, so they knew that there was going to be a sequel, and the main production didn't take place until the original game's release in May 2010. So Rockstar San Diego, the studio behind the original game, had a really kind of a rough outline of what was to come in the sequel by mid-2011, so it's about a year later. By late 2012, they've had rough scripts of the game, and then they realized that a group of distinct studios would not necessarily work, co-opted all of its studios into one large team to facilitate the development between 1,600 people. So it's a major project, a total of about 2,000 people worked on the game, and it actually shows. I keep saying this so frequently. When you watch the major AAA blockbusters coming out of Bungie, Rockstar, Ubisoft, Bethesda, BioWare, you really get the impression of that sort of industrial element that's been present on the production from the very go. It's very similar to what you had in Hollywood industry during the 1930s, where everything was being run as an assembly line, and the interest for new film was massive, but there was no interest in that film being kept as something valuable once it had its own first run and once it collected the revenues. And that's just simple and clear and well embedded within that sort of consumer's mentality that once you've eaten a bag of crisps, you don't really need to keep the bag, and I'm afraid that's the way they wanted it. That's not the case here, because we know that these games are masterpieces. They are a work of modern art. They are really a product of hard labor of very, very many people who were involved. As we've heard, more than 2,000 involved in this game, and we know after watching them and playing the game that they will be cherished and treasured and looked at for many years ahead. So there's not going to be that degree of dismissal that was present in the old days with film in particular. And this game did have presentations and marketing campaign that would be equivalent to any of those, like Star Wars and Black Panther, and therefore they received such massive big sales. But I was really amazed with two things. First of all, the quality of work that was completed. Secondly, its marketing budget, and thirdly, the way the adverts were being presented, in cinemas on a massive big screen without cinematic content. So anyone who is very keen on westerns, or people who would have gone to see games like Revenant, would really want to find out for themselves what this game was about, and perhaps invest not just into the game but also in a console, therefore bringing in many new gamers into the arena. So basically they wanted to If you think about the old game, the main theme there was to protect family at all costs, whilst in this one we have a story of the breakdown of a family in the form of the Vandaling gang. The team was interested in exploring the story and why the gang fell apart, as frequently mentioned in the first game. Rockstar's vice president of creativity, Dan Houser, was inspired by film and literature when writing the game, although he avoided contemporary works to avoid being accused of stealing ideas. Well, I told you, he did really watch lots of these westerns, and if there's one film that really blends in perfectly with Red Dead, well, two films maybe. If you're looking at the very beginning of the game, that would be the Cold Mountain, because it's happening in kind of Alaska and it's happening in an area which is covered in snow, it's actually in the winter. And if you're looking at the landscapes, the terrain, the locations and settlements, then it's Once Upon a Time in the West, Sergio Leone's masterpiece from the 60s. And then we've had the team working on the game was not specifically inspired by film or art, but the real locations. Well, I would disagree with that, really. I think that it's a mixture of the two. The team was focused on creating an accurate reflection of the time with people and locations. The citizens in the game feature a contrast between rich and poor, while the locales contrast between the civilization and the wilderness. And that's beautifully represented, and that's the way it was. That's the way it was. When you get to one of the towns in there, you'll see that somebody is living or is the owner of a fantastically well-developed, expensive settlement, and on the other hand there will be a building next door which is basically a shack. And I'm afraid that degree of social contrast or the class contrast is still persisting in the US of today, obviously on a very different level, but you do get it, and I think it's very unlike when compared to what we have in Europe. Not to say that we do not have poverty, we have a lot of poverty, but it is represented in a very, very different way, and it does have its own historic reasons. I think if you watch the game, you will get some ideas on as to why that evolved in such fashion in the US as well. And they also decided that the player would control one character in Red Dead Redemption 2, opposed to 3 protagonists in the previous title, which was GTA 5, and that's in order to follow the character more personally and understand how the events impact him. They felt a single character felt more appropriate for the narrative structure of a Western. I really agree. I think this is really a very good decision and a good way of pursuing the game, because I had a difficulty initially on my first run to really pull all the ropes, and if I had 3 characters it would have been even more difficult. Having one character makes it a bit more consistent, and we have a clear focal point, so we know exactly what we want to be watching, so that's absolutely bang on. I really appreciated it, and applaud Rockstar for using the similar sort of viewpoint and structure that we've seen in the original game as well. Also, this is the first game from Rockstar built specifically for the next generation consoles. They tested these consoles' technical capabilities when porting GTA 5, which was originally released on the previous PS3 and 360 ones, and once the team had defined what limitations were sustainable, they found the areas that required the correct focus. And one of the Rockstar's goals with Red Dead Redemption 2, first of all, was that gameplay was to make the player feel as though they are living in the world, so they become an active participant in everything that's happening in there, instead of playing missions and watching cutscenes. And I really think that that has been achieved absolutely 100%. You really feel properly embedded within this world. You become part of that nature. Your beastly aggressive drives will be reflecting the animals and the ferocious weather conditions and many other adversaries that you will be, or adverse, you could say, situations that you will be facing in the wild. So that really is delivered in a masterly fashion. And also they really wanted to have a method which is used to achieve, so they would basically lead you to an understanding that this was through the gang's moving camp, or where the player can interact with the characters, and you will get much more through these interactions on their psychology and overall behavior of that group, and the overall way that people lived in those days, because obviously not everyone was setting up camps who was an outlaw. You had lots of other camps of explorers and researchers and people who were looking for another area of the country where they could live. But you get the flavor as you play the game. The team ensured that the characters maintained the same personality and moved from cutscenes to gameplay in order to make the world feel more alive and very realistic. Woody Jackson, who worked with Rockstar on the original game and Grand Theft Auto 5, returned to compose Red Dead Redemption's to the original score. And the score is magnificent. If you can listen to it in separation, you will thoroughly enjoy it. It's very atmospheric, at times very eerie, and perfectly aligned with the environment and all the activities that you are getting through. Also, it has 3 different types of score, and that's narrative, which is heard during the missions in the game's story; interactive, when the player is roaming through the open world, or in multiplayer; and also the environmental. That's the 3rd one, which includes campfire singing songs or a character playing music in the world. The game's music frequently reacts according to the player's decisions in the world. So Jackson purchased several instruments from the Wrecking Crew that were featured on classic cowboy films. In total, over 110 musicians worked on the music for the game, so it's a very large number. Daniel Lanois produced the original vocal tracks for the game, collaborating with artists such as D'Angelo, Willie Nelson, Rhiannon Giddens, and Josh Homme. Director of music and audio Ivan Pavlich also engaged saxophone player Colin Stetson and experimental band Senea and musician Arca to work on the score. So it's a magnificently large group of diverse musicians to be fitting in if and when, with the actual activity within the game. So this Rockstar Games teased the release of the game on October the 16th, 17th of 2016, and the official announcement was on the 18th of October of the same year. So initially they were looking at the release in the second half of 2017. They had to delay it several times, and like any other major studio that takes wise decisions, a bit like 343 recently with Destiny Infinite, they've taken a decision that the game was not ready, and it was not, they didn't want to cave in to the pressure from the community. They just really want to make sure that the game was amazing, worked perfectly on the technical front, and everything was as it should be. And believe you me, it was a good decision, and the game came across as the best possible after all these delays. So the October the 26th of 2018 was the date when the game was released, and according to Rockstar, the game required a lot of extra development in order to feel fully polished, and it does feel like that. So basically, to inflate pre-order sales, Rockstar collaborated with several retail outlets to provide special edition versions of the game. Also, you can order it online in a digital format, of course. Companion app, released alongside the game for Android and iOS devices, acts as a second screen, wherein the player can view in-game items such as catalogs, journals, and a real-time mini-map. So if you're doing it similar to what we have in Destiny, with those compendiums and guides and everything, make sure you download it to your Android and use it extensively as you go along. And then finally, the game was released for Microsoft Windows a year later on November the 5th of 2019, and was a launch title for Stadia when the service launched on November the 19th. The Windows version was also presented with some visual and audio improvements. As you would imagine, the game was received very, very well. 10 out of 10, 5 out of 5, literally everywhere, and the praise was received from every online gaming hub available, from the newspapers in Britain like The Guardian and Telegraph and The Independent and any other, to Polygon and IGN and all the other ones, Push Square. All of them were giving it 10 out of 10 and were really amazed with its magnitude, the volume. historic accuracy, the quality of the gameplay, and everything else. So, as you could see, we have been giving you a very detailed introduction on this wonderful adventure game. We've heard all that is related to the game, and we've heard a lot about its development, its characters, the intentions that Rockstar Studios had. Most importantly, we also aligned this to certain historic facts in American history. We learned that Mandolin Gang is very similar to Butch Cassidy's and to some of the other guys, hoodlums, that were doing bank robberies and causing mayhem in the Wild West, the turn of the last century. And then also we learned about the cities that have the names that are not easily recognized but actually represent the real ones, Saint Denis being, for instance, New Orleans. And the story goes on and on. So thank you so much for joining me today for this podcast. It's a new format for introductions and the streams where I will be introducing certain games and activities. We'll have many of those to come. I felt it was a good idea to put them in a separate section, so we have a format that is making it easy for anyone who wants to be watching it on playback to access on YouTube and Twitch. And also it gives us an opportunity to get some dialogue for everyone who's watching it on VOD. You know, people throw in questions and want to set up some social networking forums for further discussions, and so that had been a bit difficult with the overall streams where everything was joined together. And I think although I'll still do a bit of introduction every single time where I stream my favorite games here, or the new ones, or any other content, we'll be doing some podcasts that are specifically dedicated to a particular game, product, subject, or part of the industry, in order to get some of that dialogue going. So I'll have a 10-15 minute break. After that, we'll go and crack on with some serious Red Dead Redemption 2 gameplay. We've gone already through about 4 streams so far. Today's going to be the 5th one. I'm a bit anxious about the game disappearing from Xbox Game Pass. I really wanted it to stay there until Christmas so we could complete everything on the story missions, the campaign front, but that looks very unlikely, and I think it'd be very difficult and unlikely for me to be forking out £80 to purchase the Ultimate Edition. We'll try to do our best, get as far as possible, enjoy the game in full, and complete as many tasks as we find. So stay with us, and we'll resume in about 15 minutes. I'll have a breath of fresh air, bite to eat and stretch a bit, and then we'll do some wonderful Red Dead 2 gameplay here on my channel. For all of you who are watching, tell me why. We are going to resume that next week. The game is fairly short and the chapters do not last very long, so having a stream of a few hours will cover it. We've had the initial stream of chapter 2 already on Friday, and I want to be hammering really this game for as long as possible, as long as it's here on Xbox Game Pass, in order to get us as far as practicable. So that is the reason for it. We have the Plague Tale that will be also continued next week. I really absolutely feel tempted to go back to it at any moment, because the story is so emotional and so gripping. You really want to find out what is ahead of our protagonists, and we'll carry on with that. And in addition to this, I'm also playing 2 wonderful games outside of my streaming hour, and these games are Nightcall. I talked about it earlier in the week, a small indie game done by a French developer and taking place in Paris, that gives you a phenomenal perspective on France of today, and I most highly recommend it to everyone. And not just that it is very kind of socially involved, it is also a game that has a wonderful murder mystery story that you'll be following throughout, and a kind of in-game mechanics that I've not seen before, that are very simple but very immersive, and most importantly a game that is wonderfully written. Its dialogue and its narrative is almost like something coming out of Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler, James Hadley Chase, Mickey Spillane, all the hard-boiled crime writers from the US. And seeing that in a French environment brings us back to the world of Jean-Pierre Melville, a wonderful French director who gave us Bob de Flambeur, you know, the big film noir from the 1950s, and some of the films of Robert Hossein, maybe films like Shoot the Pianist of Francois Truffaut, and all the other nice ones that we've had the pleasure. What is going on in here? I've got some interferences for some reason. I don't know what's going on. I could see that my display was disappearing. Hopefully you were able to hear all I said. And I just said that I hope that anyone who's doing Nightcall will also be happy to revisit some of the French classics that include Bob de Flambeur, and that's Jean-Pierre Melville's film from the 50s, Shoot the Pianist of Francois Truffaut's, two that come to mind, Rififi of Jules Dassin's, and Jules Dassin's, I should say, rather than Jules Dassin, because he was an American director. So Jules Dassin, and all the other ones. Robert Hossein also had a couple of very interesting, less well-known flicks at the time. You know, the film noir that was imported from the US as a concept and then developed in a very French, very urban environment, and Nightcall is exactly that. And the last but not least is Madison Maiden, a wonderful, very scary, very atmospheric horror game, horror-struck survival game that I'm also enjoying at the moment. I played already for a few days, and very gripping. I mean, it's really suspenseful, and you really feel for the characters. So that's another game that we'll try here in a while, and presently also accessible through Xbox Game Pass. So really, quite frankly, there are too many games to play at the moment, and we are trying our best to enjoy all of those to the full. And certainly I'm hoping that my streams and the gameplay here of Red Dead have been very enjoyable for everyone. And I certainly hope that you had learned something from the introduction today on Rockstar Games Studios, as well as all the works that have been put into this wonderful adventure game. And then I'd like to invite you to carry on watching once I resume. We're going to broadcast in about 15 minutes. We'll have a lot more gameplay here in Red Dead 2. So thanks for watching. Thank you for being here with us today. Hope you enjoyed the introduction and all of our descriptions of the reference points that bring this game into the overall American history context. And I hope to see you in about 50 minutes. So on that note, I shall say see you all later.